Hi, I'm Alex. She poisoned her boss. Was it an accident? Let's get into it. The phone in the dispatcher's hand vibrated against the glass desk, a harsh, buzzing reminder that someone was in the dark. On the other end, a woman's voice was not screaming, not crying, but speaking with a terrifying, robotic calmness as she described a scene that defied every instinct of human survival. She told the operator that the body of her husband was slumped over the kitchen table, that his skin had turned a shade of blue that looked almost purple in the flickering candlelight, and that the air inside the house smelled sweet, like overripe peaches rotting in the sun. She listed the time, 2:14 a.m. on a rainy Tuesday in November, and she listed the location, a sprawling, isolated estate in the rolling hills of Oakhaven. But the most chilling part was not the body. It was the way she paused before continuing, the silence stretching for 3 long seconds before she whispered, "He said he wouldn't do it again, but he did. He took the pill." The dispatcher heard the click of the phone being set down, the silence that followed, and then the sound of a floorboard creaking as someone else walked into the room, their footsteps heavy and deliberate. The woman did not scream for help. She simply sat there, staring at the man on the table, waiting for the police to arrive to find what looked exactly like a suicide. But to understand what really happened, we have to go back. Oakhaven was not a place you found on most maps, a quiet, tree-lined community nestled in the valley between the jagged peaks of the Whispering Ridge Mountains. It was a town of old money and old secrets, where everyone knew everyone, or at least knew the reputations of everyone. The air always smelled of pine needles and damp earth, and the streets were lined with Victorian homes that had been restored with painstaking care. In the heart of this community stood the Thorne Estate, a sprawling colonial mansion that seemed to loom over the other properties like a guardian. Inside lived Elias Thorne, a man of 52 who had built a fortune in synthetic pharmaceuticals. Elias was a man of precision, a scientist at heart who treated life like a series of experiments to be optimized. He was known for his cold demeanor, his sharp suit, and his inability to forgive a mistake. But the person who truly held the heart of the Thorne Estate was his wife, Clara. Clara was 28, a former ballet dancer whose grace and beauty had once made her the talk of the local society. She was gentle, soft-spoken, and carried a quiet sadness in her eyes that hinted at a life lived in the shadow of her husband's demands. Their marriage was the subject of whispered gossip, union of convenience and control that seemed to be fraying at the edges. Elias was obsessed with order, and he had tried to control every aspect of Clara's life, from her diet to her social circle. Yet, Clara had a secret. She had begun seeing a man named Julian Vane, a local architect who worked on renovations for the town library. Julian was everything Elias was not: warm, unpredictable, and passionate. Their relationship was the spark in a house of cold, calculated silence. Elias knew about Julian, or at least he suspected, but he never confronted Clara. He simply watched, a predator waiting for his prey to make a mistake. Elias had a particular phobia, a medical condition he kept hidden from almost everyone, a severe, allergic reaction to a specific compound found in a common over-the-counter painkiller he had manufactured himself. It was a secret he guarded fiercely, a vulnerability that he would kill to protect. The night of the crime was one of those rare, freezing nights where the wind howled through the valley, rattling the windows of the Thorne Estate. Clara had left the house at 5 p.m. to meet Julian for dinner at a small bistro downtown. They had stayed there until 10:30 p.m., sharing stories and laughter, a stark contrast to the silence of the house she lived in. She returned to the estate at 11:15 p.m., the rain beating against her coat. She found Elias in the kitchen, standing over the stove where a pot of soup was simmering. He looked tired, his eyes bloodshot, and he told her he had a headache and needed to take his medication. He handed her a small bottle of pills he kept in a locked cabinet in his study, a bottle labeled only with a chemical name. He instructed her to pour him a glass of water and hand him the pill. She did as he asked, watching him swallow the capsule. He walked to the table, sat down, and began to read a document. 10 minutes later, he collapsed. The timeline is precise, the sequence of events documented by the 911 call made by Clara at 2:14 a.m. She had waited 3 hours, sitting in the dark kitchen with the man she loved, watching him fade, listening to the wind outside. She had tried to wake him, but he was unresponsive. The police arrived at 2:45 a.m. They found Elias Thorne slumped over his desk, his skin cold and blue, his body rigid. The medical examiner on the scene noted the distinctive odor of sweet rot, a smell that signaled a specific type of cellular decay. But the detail that struck the investigators immediately was not the smell or the color of the skin. It was the bottle of pills. The label was torn off, and the bottle was empty. The only thing that made the scene suspicious was the presence of a single, unmarked vial on the counter, a vial that looked like it had been used to transfer liquid from the bottle to the water glass. The investigation began in earnest the next morning, but the world was already closing in, and the pieces of the puzzle seemed to fit together too perfectly. The investigation into the death of Elias Thorne moved with the speed of a well-oiled machine, but the initial interviews revealed cracks in the narrative. Clara was the first person to be interviewed, and she was shaking, her hands trembling as she held a cup of tea. She told the detectives that Elias had been under a lot of stress regarding a failing clinical trial and that he had been taking new medication to cope with the pain. She claimed he had asked her to get the pills from his study because he couldn't move his legs. But the detectives noticed something odd. Clara's hands were not just shaking, they were stained with a faint blue residue around her fingernails. When asked about it, she said she had been painting her nails that morning, a lie that the paint she used that day was a clear, glittery shade, not blue. The physical evidence was overwhelming. The empty pill bottle was found in the kitchen trash, but the label had been carefully removed. Forensic analysis of the bottle revealed traces of a specific solvent, one that was often used to strip ink from labels. The vial on the counter tested positive for a compound that matched the chemical structure of the painkiller Elias had manufactured, but in a concentration that was lethal for someone with his specific allergy. The key witness, a neighbor named Martha Gable, testified that she had seen a car leaving the estate around 11:30 p.m., a dark sedan that looked like the one Clara drove. But the detectives found a discrepancy. Martha claimed the car had a distinct scratch on the bumper, a detail she said she had seen clearly in the headlights. When they checked Clara's car, the scratch was there, but it was a fresh scratch, one that had been made that very night, likely during a hurried departure. The suspicion began to lock onto Clara, the wife who had waited 3 hours to call for help, the woman who had access to the pills, the woman who had a motive in the form of a lover and a controlling husband. However, the investigation also looked at a second suspect, a man named Julian Vane. He was the architect, the lover, the man who had been with Clara when Elias was alive. Julian was questioned extensively. He provided an alibi, stating he had been at the library until 10:45 p.m., and he had receipts and witnesses to prove it. He claimed he had nothing to do with the death, but the detectives found a strange detail in his background. Julian had a history of financial trouble, and he had recently been denied a loan by a bank that was owned by Elias Thorne's company. It looked like a motive of financial desperation, a reason to kill the man who held the purse strings. But the evidence against Julian was weak, a dead end that led nowhere. The focus remained on Clara, the wife who had been the last person seen with the victim, the one who had the access, the one who had the opportunity. The case against Clara Thorne was built on a foundation of circumstantial evidence that seemed to point to a premeditated act of murder. The prosecution argued that she had lured her husband to the kitchen, given him the pill, and then waited for him to die, all while knowing the lethal nature of the substance. They pointed to the blue stain on her hands as evidence of her contact with the solvent used to strip the label, suggesting she had prepared the bottle for the crime. They argued that her 3-hour delay was not grief, but a calculated wait to ensure the death was not reversible, to let the evidence of the poison take hold. But the defense presented a compelling narrative of innocence. They argued that Elias had taken the pill himself, that he had stripped the label to hide the bottle from Clara because he knew she would be upset about his dependency. They suggested that the blue stain was a misunderstanding, perhaps from a different source, and that the vial on the counter was part of Elias's own experiments, not a weapon. The turning point of the case came when a digital record was discovered. A week after the funeral, a forensic specialist reviewed Elias's smart home system, a device that had been overlooked in the initial sweep. The system had recorded audio from the kitchen. The playback revealed a conversation between Elias and Clara, but not the one Clara had described. The recording captured Elias saying, "I know what you're doing, Clara. I know you're trying to kill me. But I won't let you. I've already taken the antidote." The recording continued, and Elias laughed, a dark, chilling sound. "You think you can poison me? I'm the one who made this. I'm the one who knows the antidote. You're the one who's in trouble." The recording ended with a thud, the sound of Elias collapsing, and then a long silence. This was the twist that shattered the prosecution's case. The evidence suggested that Elias had taken the pill himself, that he had known he was allergic, and that he had taken the antidote, but the antidote had failed or been tampered with. Or, perhaps more likely, that Elias had staged the whole thing, that he had faked his death to escape his controlling wife and his failing life. The prosecution now had to argue that Elias had been murdered, but the evidence pointed to a man who had known the dangers and had still taken the pill. The case had shifted from a clear-cut murder to a complex web of deception, where the victim might have been the mastermind of his own death. The trial of Clara Thorne was a spectacle that rivaled the most famous cases of the century. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension and the hum of whispers. The prosecution painted a picture of a woman who had been driven to murder by a loveless marriage and a desperate need for freedom. They argued that the recording was a fabrication, a trick played by Elias to frame Clara, or that Elias had taken the pill to test the antidote and had died from an unexpected reaction. The defense, however, played the card of uncertainty. They argued that Elias was a man who loved risk, a man who had spent his life pushing boundaries, and that he had taken the pill as a final gamble. They suggested that the blue stain on Clara's hands was from a different source, perhaps a paint she had used for a hobby, and that the vial was part of his own experiments. The judge allowed the recording to be played again, and the courtroom fell silent as Elias's voice echoed through the speakers. The final argument was a masterpiece of legal strategy. The prosecution said that the recording proved Elias knew Clara was planning something, but he had taken the pill anyway, which meant Clara was innocent. The defense said that the recording proved Elias had taken the pill, but he had died, which meant Clara was guilty. The jury deliberated for 3 days. They returned with a verdict of not guilty by reason of insufficient evidence. Clara Thorne was acquitted, but the price was high. She lost her home, her reputation, and her freedom to the public eye. Elias Thorne was dead, and the world was left wondering if he had been a victim or a villain. The community of Oakhaven was divided, some believing Clara was a victim of her husband's manipulation, others believing she was a murderer who had escaped justice. The aftermath was a bitter pill to swallow for everyone involved, a testament to the ambiguity of truth and the complexity of the human heart. So, where do we stand on this case? Was Clara Thorne a victim of her husband's self-destructive nature, a woman who loved a man who was too obsessed with control to let her live? Or was she a cold-blooded killer who used her husband's obsession against him, waiting 3 hours for him to die so she could claim the inheritance and start a new life with her lover? The case for guilt is strong: the blue stain on her hands, the delay in calling 911, the lack of a credible alibi for the time of death, and the fact that she was the only one with access to the poison. The case for innocence is equally compelling: the recording that suggested Elias knew he was taking the pill, the possibility that he staged his own death, and the lack of direct evidence linking Clara to the act of murder. There is no smoking gun, no confession, only a series of events that can be interpreted in 2 very different ways. The evidence is in. You decide. Did Clara Thorne really kill her husband, or did she simply watch him take his own life? Was the recording a sign of his guilt, or a lie to protect her? I want to hear from you. Drop your verdict in the comments below, guilty or not. Do you think the justice system got this one right, or did a woman escape punishment for a crime that seems so clear? The story of Elias and Clara is a haunting reminder that the truth is often hidden in the shadows, and sometimes the person who seems guilty is the one who was wronged. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the mind of a killer and the complexity of the law, make sure you subscribe to Guilty or Not Cases and hit that bell icon so you never miss a case. Next week, we're diving into a story that will make your hair stand on end, a case of arson that burned down more than just a building. It's a story of greed, betrayal, and a fire that was lit from the inside out. Don't miss it. Until then, stay safe, stay curious, and remember, the truth is always out there, waiting to be discovered.